Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we will continue our reading of The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 38, which is page 544 of the text. It's called Manifest Destiny's Child. It starts with a quote coming from a letter written by John W. Childress in Nashville to President Polk in Washington on July 22nd, 1846, which said, "We have bought at this place a very likely girl, 13 years old, well grown and smart, active, etc., for $405. And Colonel Campbell has just left for her home, with her for home. I consider it a fine bargain." So as you can see, he was leaving with a fancy girl, going off with some 13-year-old black enslaved girl to have his way with her. As the prospect for annexing of Texas for the Cotton Kingdom created a speculative boom in young African Americans, the price of slaves shot up by about 30%. Anticipating the sustained bull market that did in fact set in, President Polk brought a total of 19 people quietly from his perch at the White House between 1845 and 1848. Except for a dip occasioned by the Panic of 1857, slave prices never went down again, but surged higher than ever. We are and always have been the value. We are the capital. We are the money. That's why on money in previous years and previous generations before the Civil War was printed with Black enslaved people on it. In an article supporting the annexation of Texas, the Democratic Party propagandist John L. Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny, a phrase that has never gone away. O'Sullivan's article is notable for its fusion of anti Black and anti Mexican racism in a way that would become a permanent part of the social landscape of the American Southwest. In attempting to deny that the annexation and annexing of Texas was about slavery, O'Sullivan asserted in a wordy prose typical of the era the principle that has become known as diffusionism, that the Upper South would become free of its slaves by selling them to Texas. Expecting, as many did, that Texas would be carved up into several states, he used the metaphor of wastewater to describe the enslaved population, as he anticipated the day when slavery would no longer be necessary and Black people would be flushed into Mexican society. He said, "The annexation will tend to facilitate and hasten the dependent disappearance of slavery from all the northern tier of the present slave states, cannot surely admit of serious question. The greater value in Texas of the slave labor now employed in those states must soon produce the effect of draining off that labor southwardly by the same unvarying law that bids water descend the slope that invites it. Every new slave state in Texas will make at least one free state from among those in which that institution now exists. It is undeniably such much gained for the cause of the eventual voluntary abolition of slavery that it should have been thus drained off toward the only outlet which appeared to furnish such probability of the ultimate disappearance of the Negro race from our borders. So remember, they always had this plan, this scheme, that once our enslavement was over, that we would disappear. We would go into Mexico. We would go back to Africa. They would send us somewhere. They would slaughter us. There was always the plan that once we finished our labor here and built this country for them and made them wealthy and rich, that we would just vanish. The Spanish Indian American population of Mexico, Central America, and South America afford the only receptacle capable of absorbing that race whenever we shall be prepared to slough it off, emancipate it from slavery, and simultaneously necessary to remove it from the midst of our own. Themselves already of mixed and confused blood, and free from the prejudices which among us so insuperably forbid the social amalgamation which can alone elevate the Negro race out of a virtually servile degradation, even though legally free. The regions occupied by those populations must strongly attract the Black race in that direction. The project, branded as Manifest Destiny, was thus based on an utterly racist vision of ethnic cleansing, not only of Native Americans, but of African Americans. The boundaries of Texas were not yet defined. The Republic of Texas's claims extended south to the Noches River, but Polk went farther south and west to the Rio del Bravo Norte, or the Rio Grande, insisting on having the wide strip between the two rivers that was still populated mostly by wild horses. It was grassland then, barren and dusty now. He sent troops under the command of General Zachary Taylor, who was a wealthy Virginia-born Louisiana sugar planter who owned 147 slaves. And even though Polk distrusted Taylor because he was a Whig, Taylor positioned his men on the banks of the Rio Grande and provoked an incident, creating the pretext to invade Mexican territory and take as much of it as possible, all the way out to California. Polk asserted a new level of executive power, daring Mexico to fight and daring Congress to stop him. He signed the Congressional Act declaring war on Mexico on May 13, 1846, and almost at once, he advised his cabinet that he intended to acquire not only Mexico, but California and Mexico, as well as Texas. The latter territory included the present states of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Nevada as well. There was also a legacy of conflicting claims to Oregon, but the South did not want a war with cotton-consuming Britain over it, so there wasn't one. Occupied with the fighting in Mexico, Polk compromised with Great Britain to divide up the Oregon Territory, the lower part of which was already receiving American settlers and covered wagons. Ratified on June 18, 1846, the Oregon Treaty gave Americans claims to 54 degrees, 40 minutes, or fight, which would have extended American ownership up to Alaska, accepting instead the 49th parallel, which is the present US-Canada border, that definitively brought present-day Oregon and Washington, including the highly desirable Puget Sound Harbor, under US control. Oregon would not be a slave territory, but when it applied for admission into the Union as a state in 1858, its constitution forbade free Black people from entering the state, as well as denying the ones who are already there the rights to testify in court, make contracts, and own property. Similar prohibitions would forbid the entry of free Blacks into the free soil states of Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. In August of 1846, Polk asked Congress for an appropriation of $2 million to support negotiations with Mexico in anticipation of victory. But anti-slavery members of the House on August 8th tacked onto the appropriations bill the proviso that would make Pennsylvania Representative David Wilmot's name execrated throughout the South. The Wilmot Proviso prohibited slavery in any territory to be acquired from Mexico, following the theory that Wilmot explained in 1847 keeps slavery within given limits, and in time it will wear itself out. Its existence can only be perpetuated by constant expansion. When the Wilmot Proviso passed the House, 85 to 75, it wasn't on a party line vote, but a sectional vote, North versus South. This was a harbinger of things to come. It failed in the sectionally balanced Senate, and the South was furious that it had been proposed at all. Anti-slavery politicians had no influence in the Senate, but the Supreme Court, in the Supreme Court, and certainly not in the executive branch. But free states dominated the House of Representatives. As the slave states slipped farther and farther behind in population, they became more insistent on keeping the balance of senators, which meant add more slave states. As Wilmot argued, slavery could only be perpetuated by constant expansion. So even as they were planning this expansionist project of going all the way to California and up to Alaska and out to Oregon and expanding these territories and fighting these wars over territories and then giving countries hush money to shut them up so that they felt better about getting their behinds beat and having their land taken, they were planning to expand slavery into these new areas. But Wilmot was saying, if we stop them from expanding slavery, it'll stop slavery from continuing in our country, which was already illegal. It was already illegal in 1847 to bring in slaves from Africa, but it was not illegal to breed slaves, nor was it illegal to trade slaves within the Americas. So if they were already over here, Black people could be enslaved in any part of the Americas, North, Central, or South America. Though pressed by his duties as commander-in-chief of a war conquest, Polk found time to advise his recently widowed sister Eliza that she should invest what little money she had in buying people. In a letter dated August 16th, 1846, he suggested that she move in with their mother and apply the little money she had saved to increase your slave force on your plantation so as to enlarge your yearly income. So this man was president of the United States telling his sister that she should buy slaves because that's where the money that's where the money was at. The Mexican War occupies much of my time at present, Polk wrote in a classic understatement to a correspondent on October 7th. A letter written to him 2 days later documents how his farm made $25 less commission on a deal to acquire a girl who could be put to childbearing. With his hands full, Polk became more reliant than ever on his brother in law, and one of them, Robert Campbell Jr., wrote him about some recent planned purchases, including one which he posted a small profit at a widow's expense through flipping the ownership of an enslaved boy in exchange for a likely girl at the beginning of her reproductive years. Bragging on his deal, Campbell discussed the children like they were mules. I've sold the boy Jim and bought for you that I gave $392 for the widow to the widow Colburn for $450 and bought a girl, Jane, who was 20 pounds heavier for $425 and likely 12 or 13 years old. It is one of the best trades I have ever made. I would have given the boy for the girl even. General Winfield Scott, who, like Taylor, was distrusted by Polk as a Whig, bombarded the historic city of Veracruz for 18 days in March of 1847. When the troops entered the city to occupy it, they found starving people and rotting corpses. As Mexico capitulated, Polk didn't have the ideal negotiator at hand, but Secretary of State James Buchanan recommended his clerk, the number 2 man at the State Department, who ran the department during Buchanan's extended absences. His name, Nicholas P. Trist. Trist's political credentials were impeccable, and after years in Cuba, he spoke Spanish. As negotiations dragged on, Polk fired him, but he remained on the job, negotiating the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with no official status whatsoever. Moreover, he didn't comply with the instructions, which had been to secure Alta and Baja California both. Mexico retained Baja California, which the United States had, after all, not conquered. Trist did manage, however, to secure the Grand Harbor at San Diego as the southernmost border of the territory to be acquired. Polk was angry at losing Baja California, but he had a treaty, public support was waning, and the 1848 elections were looming. He made the deal, paying about $15 million for Canada and the New Mexico Territory, about a third of Mexico, including its farmland and the Northern California gold fields, which would be discovered mere months after the purchase. Polk vindictively made sure that Trist did not receive his back salary for the time he spent in negotiations. It was the end of Trist's governmental career, and for the rest of their lives, he and Virginia Randolph Jefferson, Trist, lived in poverty. The United States hoped to annex Cuba as well, and a suitor came a-calling to broker the deal. There were no tickets available to the sold-out performances in New York City by Havana's Opera Company, the grandest in the hemisphere, of Giuseppe Verdi's new smash hit, Ernani. But it noted in the New York Herald of June 28, 1847, they gave a special performance in honor of President Polk while he was visiting New York. If Polk attended, there is no mention of it in his diary or letters. It is difficult to imagine that with his chronic bowel complaints, he enjoyed the four-act Italian opera much, nor is it likely that such a spectacle was Sarah Polk's cup of tea. The company's impresario was none other than slave trader and fish dealer Pancho Marti, who had imported the best Italian talent to staff his troupe. The performance, in honor of Polk, was a demonstration not only of the richest and high level of imported culture of Cuba, but of who the right man was to make a deal for Cuba, Pancho Marti. The following year, John L. O'Sullivan began having meetings with Polk to urge him to acquire Cuba. And in June of 1848, Polk offered Spain $100 million for the island. They declined. Thank you. Polk and a host of adventurers made plans to take Cuba by conquest. We have a president today trying to take land. I wonder if this is where he got the playbook from. New Orleans could be a hellhole of disease in the warm months, and Isaac Franklin took ill there. After traveling back to his Bellevue plantation, he died there suddenly on May 4th, 1846, at the age of 56, from what a doctor called congestion of the stomach, which was likely cholera. A month later, after his distraught wife, Adelicia, had returned to Tennessee, she helplessly watched as two of their three daughters died 2 days apart from sudden cases of croup and bronchitis. At the time of Franklin's death, he was possibly the richest man in President Polk's home state of Tennessee. He owned 10,000 acres of land in Tennessee, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Plus, he had claims in Texas, railroad bonds, and a large, continually increasing number of slaves. His estate was managed by his father in law and John Armfield, yes, that Armfield, as trustees, each receiving a 2.5% commission, so that Armfield was still working for Franklin. By 1851, when the trustees got rid of the responsibility and returned his estate over to his widow, it was worth almost $710,000, which was perhaps $21.5 million in 2014 dollars. 69% of the value of Franklin's 6 Louisiana plantations was in its more than 600 slaves, who were worth $363,927 out of the estate's total value of $525,674.85. During the 5 years of Armfield and Hayes's trusteeship, the slaves registered 30 deaths, 80 births, realizing a profit from natural increase. The deaths and births were broken out and inventoried in separate schedules in the estate proceedings, in which one can see that the average age of death was 29, but all 4 of the deceased having died before the age of 50. The births, 80 children of 4 years or younger, were listed by name, mother, age, and color. Examples include Madison, child of Caroline, 3 years old, Black. Bradley, child of Martha Winchester, an infant, Black. Millie, child of Matilda Trotman, 4. Griff, Lynn, ditto, etc. What would they be worth in a few years? An April 1857 article in DuBose Review cheered the high prices fetched at the sale of children in Texas with terms of 1 or 2 years and 10% interest. DuBose printed the names, ages, and prices fetched. Caroline, 11 years old, breeding age, $1,100. Frank, 9 years old, male, $805. Little Alec, 7 years old, $810. Catherine, 10 years old, $700. Flora, 6 years old, $895. Sarah, 9 years old, $890. Dick, 7 years old, $650. Sam, 3 years old, $450. Phoebe, 10 years old, $655. Ben, 6 years old, $405. So as you can see, the males consistently sold for less money than the females. And the closer in breeding age they were, the more money they got for them. Because as we can see, Caroline, who was 11, who probably had started her period, was going for $1,100. But Catherine, who was 10, just a year younger, was only going for $700. That was a $400 difference just because Caroline had started her period. In his will made in 1841, Franklin directed how many more hands were to be purchased for each of the plantation and specified how the executors were to improve his holdings with 2 more plantations called Panola and Loango to be developed alongside the 4 already existing on the land. It's not clear why Franklin wanted to have the 2 plantations, Loango and Angola, named after Central African slave markets on opposite sides of the Congo River, since he didn't do business with Africans. But Angola was the biggest antebellum slave trader that is what the biggest antebellum slave trader called his plantation. The prison, by that name today, is on those same grounds in East Feliciana Parish in Franklin's infamous bequest to Louisiana's cultural life. So, New Orleans saxophonist Charles Neville was right when he said the land occupied by the Louisiana State Penitentiary was formerly slave breeding plantations. Neville spent 3.5 years there for having had 2 reefers. Any Louisiana musician can sing you. Now 6 months ain't no sentence. 1 year ain't no time. They got boys in Angolan doing 9 to 99. Isaac Franklin left a large footprint. His idyllically situated Fairview Mansion today anchors a beautiful upscale residential development with more than 800 large homes, a golf course, a country club, and Franklin's mansion and tomb. The tale of 2 plantations at the other end of the desirably scale, at the other end of the desirability scale from Fairview, Isaac Franklin's Louisiana land ultimately passed to the state of Louisiana, retaining the name Angola to cover all 5 previously distinct plantation tracts. In the last decades of the 19th century, it was run as a plantation using convict labor, and since 1901, it has been home to the Louisiana State Penitentiary, known internationally as Angola, a singular institution even in the harsh annals of the American penology. The former agricultural prison has remained an agricultural prison, a self-sustaining plantation that forces its inmates to get their hands cut up because at Angola, they still pick cotton by hand instead of using machinery. Angola houses 6,300 inmates. 76% of them are Black, and 71% of them are serving life sentences. And it employs 1,800 people to keep them incarcerated. The continuity of Angola prison ties the historical slave trade to a living modern legacy of unequal treatment, income disparity, social pathology, and mass incarceration. The penal regime it imposes on convicts bears a chilling resemblance to the antebellum slave experience. Adelicia Franklin married twice more after Isaac Franklin died. Her first remarriage at Fairview on May 8, 1849, was a major social event. As her ex-president Polk's diary entry read, "This evening Miss Polk and myself attended the marriage of Miss Franklin, a wealthy widow of this city. She was married at her own house to Mr. Acklin of Huntsville, Alabama. The supper and whole entertainment was upon a magnificent scale. I met at the wedding many leading Whigs and Democrats and was courteously and kindly treated by all." It was one of Polk's last social events. He had just returned to Nashville after leaving the presidency because he did not get reelected in 1848. On his trip home from Washington, worn out from prosecuting the war with Mexico, he noted in his diary the presence of cholera on the boat. At every stop, he was given balls, public dinners, and received enormous numbers of visitors, despite suffering from a derangement of stomach and bowels and feeling greatly wearied and worn down. In New Orleans, Mayor Abdiel Crossman denied there was a cholera epidemic, but there was, and insisted that the fatigued ex-president come to a public dinner with 250 guests. As Polk continued on by riverboat, there was a cholera on board again. Various passengers died, and once in Nashville, he noted in his diary various people in the town being taken ill with cholera. His penal his his penultimate entry on June 1st ends saying, "During the prevalence of cholera, I deem it prudent to remain as much as possible at my own house." But he died of it too on June 15th, a little more than 10 weeks after leaving the presidency. I wonder, are there any other presidents that will uphold that particular uh, presidential tradition? You know, passing on after they leave the office. In his one term, Polk had reshaped the nation. In the process, he had reached the westward limits of slavery expansion. Slavery was exploding in eastern Texas, but it would grow no more to the west beyond that. Though the slave power would fight hard, it was a losing battle for California. Most of the value of Polk's estate consisted of slaves. He wasn't worth 1/10 of what Isaac Franklin was worth. And in his will, Polk, ever the politician, wrote that, should I survive her, Sarah, unless influenced by circumstances which I do not now foresee, it is my intention to emancipate all my slaves, and I have full confidence that if at her death she shall deem it proper, she shall emancipate them. But as in the cases with Martha Washington and Dolly Madison, who, like Sarah Polk, were survivors of slaveholding presidential husbands, she didn't deem it proper to emancipate them. Wearing black for the rest of her life, Sarah lived to be 88 years old at Polk Place, wearing black for the rest of her life. The mansion that had occupied together for only 3 months, with her husband's tomb in the front yard. She had not been weakened by the multiple childbirths and miscarriages like so many other women of her era, and she was wealthy and savvy. In 1860, she cashed out, selling one half of her interest in her plantation, including all but 6 of her 56 slaves, to a relative for $28,500, which is over $800,000 in 2014 dollars. It was a fraction of what Adelicia Franklin got. In terms of territorial gains, Polk's Manifest Destiny War with Mexico did very well, bringing the U.S. under control of more than 500,000 square miles, which was sparsely even populated by Native Americans. As the Texans began slowly learning the Mexican ways of handling horses and cattle that became known as cowboying, they learned a new way of cooking. They called themselves white people in opposition to the Mexicans, whom they typically treated as an inferior race. The white people began expelling the Mexicans from their own towns. For one thing, in a frontier society that there was chronically a shortage of women. Mexican men were taking enslaved women away, thereby robbing slaveholders of the future increase that they saw as their due. One newspaper reported, Matagorda, the people of Matagorda County have held a meeting and ordered every Mexican to leave the country. They have no fixed domicile, but hang around the plantations, taking the likeliest Negro girls for wives, and they often steal horses and these girls too, and endeavor to run to Mexico with them. So as you can see, they were pissed because their profits were running down to Mexico far and away, or out to Florida far and away, because these Mexicans found Black women beautiful. The annexation of Texas kicked the Southern slave market into gear. But as the market for slaves heated up, no single firm dominated the trade the way that Franklin and Armfield previously had. No slave trading firm grew like Lehman and Brother did, dealing cotton. And there was no major slave retailing corporation that survived the war to trade in something else. Instead of the market consolidating after Franklin, it fragmented. Slave traders were mostly small shops, including many part timers who left no records and much less a coherent paper trail than the Franklin's Company. Perhaps no one else had the ability to focus on so many partners on a common set of business goals across the geographic area, much less accomplish complex tasks of keeping the money flowing smoothly at all times. The 1840 census showed 2,487,355 slaves, and the 1850 census registered a 28.8% increase for a total of 3,204,313 slaves. American slavery had never stopped growing since its beginning in the 17th century Virginia. It would never stop growing, or the whole system would collapse under its own weight. More and more slave states were looking to export their young. People from every slave state could be found on sale in the market at New Orleans, where many were brought for Texas. But even so, the value of Virginia American Negroes held as a premium brand, and shipments continued from Baltimore, Alexandria, Richmond, Norfolk, and lesser ports. Austin Woolfolk's operation had been profitable. Freudenberger and Pritchett calculate that after the expenses of maintaining slave jails at both ends, feeding the captives for weeks, buying all the newspaper advertisements, chartering a vessel, and any other costs associated with the acquisition and transport of the enslaved, the Woolfolk firm had a 14% rate of return. Woolfolk married, had 5 children, and was substantially out of the business by 1842, though he continued shipping slaves until 1846. He also moved to plantation land he had bought in Louisiana. He died of tuberculosis in 1847, reduced to a mere skeleton, as his uncle described it in a letter in a tavern in Auburn, Alabama, leaving behind property in Louisiana, Alabama, and Maryland. More than 30 years later, his son, Austin Jr., sued his own mother, Emily Woolfolk, over the partitioning of the estate, which, even with slavery no longer in existence, was still worth a six-figure sum. So this boy grew up having lived in his mother's household and sued her because she sold off his daddy's slaves. Baltimore's outbound slave shipments in the 1840s exceeded those of the previous decade as more major traders got into the act. In Alexandria, the Franklin and Armfield headquarters on Duke Street were taken over by their former associate, George Kephart, who was, for a time, the biggest dealer in Alexandria. Then, by Price Birch Dealers in Slaves, James Birch's firm. Business declined by 1843. And from then until secession, the biggest Alexandria slave trader was the firm of Bruin and Hill, Joseph Bruin and Henry Hill, whose jail at 1707 Duke Street is now on the National Register of Historic Places, though it's not open to the public. Bruin seems to have sent most of his victims south in coffles, for which, unlike ocean-going vessels, there were no manifests to survive for the historical record. The abolitionists continued to bombard Congress with petitions to end slavery, and the slave trade in the capital city, Alexandria, in 1847 requested and was allowed to leave the District of Columbia and rejoin Virginia, so that the present day District of Columbia is entirely on land ceded by Maryland. 3 years later, as part of a series of compromises that occupied the nation's political class for an entire year, the Compromise of 1850, slave trading, though not slavery itself, was at last prohibited in Washington. So, as you can see, there's this back and forth, this tug of war that goes on with this country and its enslaved population. There are presidents that had slaves, that continued to acquire slaves, that wanted to profit off of the slave breeding industry. And they were proud when they could find an 11 or 12 or 13-year-old young enslaved woman, because they knew that that instantaneously meant natural increase. And I think that epigenetically, that did something to us as a people, because why would we have such high abortion rates now, taking control and ownership of our reproductive lives for any other reason but this damage, this thought that we can abort our babies and we can get rid of them and we don't have to deal with it and nobody is going to profit off of our wombs. But we have to get to the point where we are forming and developing healthy relationships with our male or female counterparts, where we are deciding to raise families with the people that we lay down and procreate with, where we are deciding that if we get pregnant, we are keeping these babies for ourselves to raise up for our nation, for our benefit. Listen, our white counterparts here in America are already reproducing below replacement value. But other nations, the Mexicans and the Arabs, are coming into this country and they are outbirthing us because they usually keep their babies. And they have a lot of them. We can no longer afford to allow our intellectually elite to not reproduce. We can no longer afford to have our girls just go to college and then work a job all for someone else. And then by the time she begins to think about having children, she's in her 40s and she has fewer viable eggs and she has less time. We have to start thinking about these things as soon as they're out of high school. We have to start thinking about these things before they enter the traditional workforce. And we have to start partnering and having young men that are of good character partner with these young women so that they can raise healthy families. Just my thoughts. All right, guys. I want to thank Bwana Haguziki, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, Sister Raw, The Forecast Radio, Brother Bakari, and you. Yes, you, dear listener. I appreciate each and every one of you for listening to me tonight. I will be back as soon as I can, and we will continue our reading of The American Slave Coast. We're almost done with this book, and then we'll be able to start our next two books. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you. I value you. Oh, and I want to say, remember to pour water for our ancestors that have joined, for our elders that have joined the ancestral realm. Charles Finch and Claudette Covet. You know who I'm trying to say. I can't say her name right now. The first woman to sit on the bus, to stand up to them white folks and not have her seat taken on the bus. Claudette Covine. Let me get her name right. Give me one moment. Give me one moment. Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin. So I want to pour water to those two and all others that have joined the ancestral realm since the last time we spoke. I appreciate you. I value you. And I hope to see you soon. Peace, guys.